Hi everybody, welcome to my story. Oh, the Muhammad Ali, the greatest. I had done well 1 through 29. Now I'm coming with a part 2 of this book, starting on page 30. The Prince of Fame. The year 1963 was the most dramatic one in American history. For Cassius Clay, it was a year of the important decisions. A week after his 21st birthday, he fought Chris Paul in Pittsburgh, knocking out the fairly unknown Fowler in the third round. The fight was seen as such an easy bout for Clay that 2 months later he was in the win again, this time in New York City against Doug Jones, considered by many to be an excellent boxer, but one he lacked in the big punch needed to become a champion. Clay predicting that he would knock out Jones in the fourth round. I'm changing the pick I made before. Still 6. Doug goes in 4. The fourth round came, and Clay tried his best to knock out Jones, but failed. In the 6th round, he worked as hard as he could to end it, but it wasn't to be, and the lost crowd at Madison Square Garden was clearly disappointed. Clay won the match on points, but some sports fans saw the medical event as a sign of Clay's true ability. It was advised not to predict in the round of his next fight, which will take place in London, England, against British heavyweight Henry Cooper. Clay ignored the advice and said that Cooper would fall in the 5th round. The crowd that Clay had been attacking in the United States were phenomenal. It was giving boxing a much-needed shot in the arm as thousands of fans showed up to see this trash-talking lone man. The Jones boy had found Madison Square Garden to captivate, but Clay's reception in England was acceptable, as the 21-year-old boxer was treated like royalty. Cheerleading crowds stopping as traffic as Clay toured the polished downtown sections of London. He realized that he was a celebrity with even thousands of miles from home and in another country. He climbed around for a series of publicly photos with the Beatles, the most popular rock and roll group in the world at the time. Posed with England's destination and give endless interviews. This insisted by English fans gave Clay a different idea of his thirst. He was being accepted in a match in a much wider portion than other sport figures. He was not announced only long and handsome, but his loop and charm were just as seizable. He was, in fact, a world figure of 21. Tuesday, June 18, 1963, the fight with Henry Cooper will reveal much about the long Clay. Some of it told troubling to those around him. The press had played up the fight, and British crowds were eager to see the real Clay. The beginning of the fight was talkable Clay. He was so much faster than Cooper that the fight seemed to be a mismatch. Time and again, he had Cooper in trouble, only to back up and go into a count dance of water. Some of the producers didn't like Clay clowning around, thinking, thinking it would cheapen the match. But then, at the end of the 4th round, Cooper launched forward with a tremendous left hook that got Clay hard on the jaw. He fell back into the ropes. Then, hands lowered, he launched forward onto the cabins. The crowd was stunned. Clay was down and confused. He got up, but it was obviously that his head still wasn't completely clear. The bell rang, ended the round, and Clay's handlers helping him back to his corner. He seems to be in trouble as he's stomping onto the door. Angela Dundee, his trainer, put smiling in his thoughts under Clay's nose, trying desperately to bring him around. The corner man put ice on his back and into his trunks, trying to shake him back to further concussiousness. Dundee, the desperate heart of fathers, thought that Clay might not be able to continue. Clay's gloves had been split orally, and now Dundee, standing hunched over Clay, opened the split. Then he called into the referee's attention. I don't know how time to that got us. Dundee Lill said, maybe a minute, but it wasn't enough. A minute. A minute for the bottle of vocabulary for the brain to recover from the damage it had been dealt. A boxer is considering that if he is down from the count of 10. 10 long seconds of brain damage so severe that a man cannot perform the simple act of standing up. The bell rang. Finally, for the next round. The split was finally taped. But the delay has given Clay ample time to recover. He came to the middle of the ring and, like a man possessed, threw more punches at Cooper than the English boxer had ever seen before. Cooper was demoralized. Most thoroughly, the referee stopped the fight. Clay raised his fist above his head in victory. Clay was a star. He was loved by people who knew nothing about the fight game. As the biggest draw in the boxing, he was also where the money was. Sonny Liston's people contact Clay. A fight for the heavyweight championship of the world was engaged. Who was Cassius Clay? Who was a black man who had grown up in a racist South. We had seen black men reaching out for wounds when they should have been reaching out for the stars. He was a black man who had felt the humiliation of seeing Walter's foundations from which he could not drink because of the color of his skin. On August 28, 1963, Clay saw the March of Washington and National Art Party, a supporter for the civil rights movement. He also saw less than a month later the bombing of black church in Birmingham, Alabama, which 4 girls were killed. But as Clay's observation in America in 1963, America was also observing him, genuine, handsome, and a world-class athlete. He was attacking a lot of attention from young people. After the Cooper fight in England, however, he began to see more charisma, Barry Sandback, a written for Sports magazine asked, How has Clay come so far and learned so incredibly little about his craft? Simply because he hasn't had to learn anything. Doug Jones is the only real follower Clay's met so far, and he too should have been set up because of his great lack of help. Why, and with in comparison to Cassius, some of us would like to buy large insurances of polishing of Cassius Clay before he steps in with good old Charlie Liston that could be worth a fortune. While the sports builder questioning Clay's ability, Clay showed his indictments at a new military position. In August, at the March on Washington, the National Ismail, Malcolm X denounced the nonviolent director of the Civil Rights Movement. By September, it was Clay who spoke against nonviolence. I'm a fellow. I believe in the eye for the eye business. I know chatting tone. I got no respect for the man who won't hit back. You kill my dog, you better a high-low cat. The National Ismail was becoming more visible to both Clay and the American public. In 1959, newscaster Mike Wallace, also who Louis Lennox, who produced a program about the National Ismail called The Hate That Hate Produced. The documentary presented to the Americans their first open look at the national anthem with its strongly anti-white supremacist centurions. The theme of the program was the American racism, directed against African Americans had created a reaction of hatred against whites. The organization was both connected with the hate was, said Wallace, the nation of Israel. The Israel. The widely seen television program acknowledges that the leader of the national Israel was the humble Elijah Muhammad, but the most outspoken and effective member was the man known as Malcolm X. Malcolm and the nation of Israel were interested in Classic Clay because Clay had already taken a partisan sentence in his permanent life and had shown interest in being on his and the principle of the nation of Israel. By 1963, Clay had been listening to Malcolm X and to ministers from the nation of Israel for some time. They're offering him Israel for some time. They're offering him an achievement both to Christianity and to the position of the black people in the United States. While the civil rights movement sought to encourage all Americans, the nation of Israel, the nation of Israel, favored the separation of the races. Moreover, the Muslims claim that the black man has suffocating resources in his own community to have separate nation without becoming a part of the white community. Cassius, not let 22, understood fully that he was a slavery and therefore was being sought by the Muslims, at least potentially entirely because of his slavery status. But why was the white community speaking him out? He knew that he made money for people involved in the boxing business. He knew that the audience he was receiving from television stations, from newspapers, from magazines were for the purpose of the exposure of his fame. Clay was a follower, and supposedly used to standing toe-to-toe with an adversary and using his skill to gain a victory. Back in another year, in 1960 or 1962, Cassius Clay will have remained Cassius Clay. Perhaps if the black Christian churches had taken a more militant sentence, had asked Clay to stand up for Christianity and fought more aggressively against racism, Clay would have taken enough the chance and continued in the relation of his mother. But in 1963, there was a controversial event which Malcolm X described as a turning point in the history of black Americans. A grassroots movement had begun in the black community early in 1963. There was a call for the nationwide protest against injustice, in which all black Americans were dismantled to their solidarity. The protest will take the shape of the march on Washington, D.C. As the movement began to gather force, President John F. Kennedy became concerned that a mass gathering of African Americans in the nation's capital will undermine the sympathy shown to the civil rights movement. Holy meetings were called and support for the protest were announced, but along with the support came a change in leadership for the grassroots dismargination and gathering on adulterating people against racism and injustice. The march became a highly organization asserting of whites and blacks. Malcolm X protest. He said that the march was losing its anger and had become, instead, a carefully controlled gathering of people more interested in loving their enemies than in a revolution. In June of 1963, Mary Garrett Evans, a black man leading the fight for voting rights for African Americans in Mississippi, was killed in fleeing his home. The March on Washington, D.C., held on August 28, 1963, was described by the New York Times as having impeded quality. Militant black force, such as the author James Baldwin, were not allowed to speak at the demonstration. The nation describing the march as a failure. Hold on just a second. Washington, D.C. was held on August 28, 1963, was described by the New York Times as having an impeded quality, but the black forces, such as the author James Baldwin, were not allowed to speak at the demonstration. The Nation of Islam describing the march as a failure, but for the gathering, the country first heard the famous "I Had a Dream" speech of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy, who had supported the black drive for civil rights, was assassinated during the Carolina was killed during the Carolina period. Americans somehow asked President Cassius Clay to be nominated. He was an athlete, a boxer, and a Christian man who should go on entering training the public with his attitudes. It was not to be. Part 2. Muhammad Ali. Angela Dundee, Cassius Clay trainer, knowing that the new people Clay was attaching an attraction to his camp. They were neatly dressed black men with close-shaven heads who were always polishing up, but Clay has attended several meetings of the National in Israel and has spoken personality Elijah Muhammad, who ran the organization from his Chicago offices. Sports worlds who questioned Clay on the civil rights movement, knowing that he was against entirely. I believe it's human nature to be with your own kind, Clay announcing in an interview with Inside Boxing. Sports world who liked Clay, the bass clown, did not view his military loyalties favorably and began to write negative things about him. Barry Sandbach of Sports Magazine said that the fighters he had been beaten were all Serbs, men selecting easy wins for Clay. This was in the summer of 1963, right after the March on Washington, and after Clay had beaten Henry Cooper in London. When more and more sports writers were beginning to distance themselves from Clay because of his political views, they all recognized that he had become an attraction in the heavyweight division. Sonny Liston's headliners knew this as well. An engagement was made for Clay to fight Liston. The fight was to be held in February 1964 in Miami Beach, Florida. Mainstream sports worlds wanted Cassius Clay to remain safely targeted away in the national they find comfortable. They wanted to write about the fight game, about how much money each boxer received for a fight, about knockout punches. They didn't like Clay bragging it, his naming it in the round in which he would face an opponent. They wanted someone responsible, he would, from time to time, say something worth pointing. What they got was Muhammad Ali. As the fight neared, Miami Beach began a publicity circus with reporters from around the world and eager to cover the event. Liston, big man, big, mean, and talent, was the overwhelming favorite, but Clay was popular and attractive. He was signed for the fight partially because of his popularity and for the new identities he was attracting. there will be a little money in a fight between the ultimate and Liston. And unknown, on paper, it was an easy match for Liston. The 31-year-old fellow had lost only once in 10 years. He had been fighting professionally. He knocked out 25 of his opponents and had ultimately destroyed Floyd Patterson, the previous champion. Liston was a huge man with knowledge and immortal strength in his massive arms. His style was based on intimidation. His deadly style was well known and had defeated many of his opponents ever before the fights had begun. Cassius Clay, nearly 10 years before the fights had begun. Cassius Clay, nearly 10 years longer than Lewis Liston, was threatened by intimidating tactics, but somehow managed to bring his own style into play. Before the fight, he taunted Liston, calling him the Bear, and for the Bear, diffusing the famous stills as being just plain ugly. Liston's had much more professional fight experiences, but Clay turned this around by saying that Sonny was too old to win. Clay attacked along black people who were becoming dislodged with the civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Frederick non-violent for blacks seeing future against people bent on committing violent acts against black justice and black children. Also, African Americans often took Clay's actions as an insider of race pride. His references to himself as a beautiful expelled on African Americans and became the influence of the black and beautiful movement. If he stands and fights, I'll kill him. If he runs, I'll catch him and kill him. Liston asked him when asking about the fight will go. It was in the end the ring when the two fighters opposed styles were most obviously. Clay's speed, not Liston's strength. There's more dominated in the fight. Liston's had good foot speed, but Clay was faster. When, in the fourth and fifth rounds, Clay had been temporarily blinding. Liston caught him on the ropes, but still couldn't hurt the longer man. It was a frustrating experience for Liston, when Clay regained his voice in the sixth and began to punish Liston. The fight was over, and astonishingly and humiliating Liston failed to come out for the seventh round. There was pandemonium in the Miami Beach that went on after the fight. Reporters rushing to the phones to record the stunning upset. Clay was screaming that he was the greatest, and everyone was trying to figure out what had happened. Liston claimed that he had hurt his left shoulder during the fight and couldn't defend himself. Some people were calling for the investigation of the sisters that had blinded Clay. It was probably for the assassin used to stop the bleeding from Liston's face that accidentally found its way into Liston's gloves and into Clay's eyes. Some sports writers still not believing that the Lion Martin Luke could beat Liston, wondering if the mob had influenced Liston to quit. The truth of the matter was that they had just seen a talent fellow, Cassius Clay, rise to the occasion and becoming a great fighter. It was after the fight in Miami Beach on that Clay, now world champion, announced that he had become a wrestler and changed his name to Muhammad Ali. Changing one's name in sports was common. Now, Will Hamilton Disby changed his name to Jack Disby. Arnold Wayman Queen changed his name to Joe Walker Smith Jr. became Sugar Ray Robinson. Glavin more popular became Will Pete. Joseph Lewis became Bauer changed his name to Joe Louis Thomas Waterco Baldwin became Rocky Guzman. Although the sports building had sat in these names changed without hesitation. They refused to accept Muhammad Ali for years after he changed his name. Sports rules continued to refer to Ali as Clay. They made a point of showing their disapproval of Ali for changing his name for religious reasons and for joining the Nation of Israel. Ali understood what was going to happen to him when he announced that he was becoming a Muslim and changing his name. He guessed that if he had made the announcement prior to the Liston fight, the march would never have been made. He also knew that he would lose. He would lose most of the popularity he had enjoyed as a nation Christian. Nominated Christian. He had been faced with a clear choice. He could have kept his gay head name and continued his real relation, co-divorcing for private, out of the public eye and enjoying lives in the untempered fame. He chose instead to offering up the thing he achieved for what he believed in. It took a great deal of courage, but it was courage that Ali would show them time and time again. Ali's conversation was not talking and taken as a sign that he changed his mind about his religious beliefs. It was felt by many, whites and blacks, that people have dumping into becoming a Muslim by the national announcement, and that organization will use Ali as a symbol of racist harlot. The racial undertones that had always been presented in American have often affected the fight game. The black boxer Jack Johnson began fighting professionally in 1897 at the age 19, when white fighters would not fight blacks. He fought for years without having any hope of getting on a championship fight. Then, when Tommy Bonds was champion, Johnson followed him from country to country, targeting and demanding a match. Finally, a promoter made the match in Sydney, Australia. Johnson beat Bonds easily and became the first black heavyweight champion. A search was made for a white person to beat Johnson. James L. Jeffries, who had retired from boxing, began to return to the ring as the Great White Hope and returned to the championship to white America. On July 4, 1910, and out of shape Jeffries returned only to lose the match against Johnson. Evidently, Johnson was arrested on a trumpeter of Moran's charge and had to leave the country. When he returned, he was put into jail for 8 months in Kansas. Many believed that his only crime was embarrassing white America. But if Ali had embarrassed some Americans by joining an organization that preaches racial separation, he was still very popular with young people, black and white. Long men identify with the handsome charisma of Long and Love in Long much the same way they did with Malcolm X. Malcolm was that strong for so long missing among long men in the black community, while Jack Johnson in his day had been popular. He had also shown little taste in the conditions of his fellow African Americans. Ali, on the other hand, began his work as a Muslim minister, speaking at adversaries in Moscow throughout the country and taking a special interest in the welfare of black children. And there was always that universal skill for using the mirror to make himself visible to the world, a very important concept to people who are so often and so visible a rematch with Lincoln was scheduled. Somehow, in his defeat, Lincoln, the bad guy, The brutal was now the good guy. The fight was scheduled for November 16, 1964, but 3 days before the fight, Ali had severe pains in his stomach. He began to vomit and asked to be taken to the hospital. When he arrived, the doctor examined him and finding rather inguinal harm. There was a chill in the muscles limiting his stomach, and the interesting that had broken through the pain was interesting. And Ali was rushed into surgery. If he stopped all the hollering, he wouldn't have hearing, Linston said. The fight was rescheduled for May 25, 1965. Meanwhile, the nation of Israel was in turmoil. Michael X. had bought was the organization in 1964 and had been friendly with its leader, Elijah Muhammad. Then, on a cold February day in 1965, Michael X was assassinated in New York City. There was talk within the black community of a coming battle between various factions of the Muslim movement. Will Ali be caught up in the hate and violence? The promotion of the rematch with Linston has sought a large market, but state efforts turned the fight down because of Ali's ties to the Nation of Israel. The fight was finally scheduled to take place at a small looping center in Leesville, Maine. Security was tight as fight time approaches. People still had doubts about Ali's skills, and Linston was the battle factor. Many people were hoping that Ali would lose because of who he was, rather than what his skills were. President Lyndon B. Johnson has signed the Civil Rights Act into law on January 2, 1964. The law offers more opportunities for blacks to enter the mainstream American life, which most African Americans want. While the Nation of Islam was suggesting that African Americans build their own communities and business, but most African Americans were Christians, as was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the most important leader in the civil rights movement. There were, in older black Christians, Americans, mixing feelings about the long Muhammad Ali. Fight night. Ali was in terrific shape, while Linston looked disposable and dull. Ali, with his 24-inch racing and powerful arms, seemed to have taken on the world in 10 minutes. The fight started with Ali using the same tactics that had clinched the championship for him in Miami Beach. He moved, he jabbed, he moved more. Linston jabbed, drew some hard punches that didn't land the diver's target, and tried to maneuver Ali into the ropes. Suddenly, Ali stepped to the right and drew a quick downward punch. Linston went down. "Get up and fight, sucker!" Ali laughed. He stood over the fallen Linston. Linston didn't get up. Josie Joe was caught. The ex-fighter was refreshing the match, trying to push Ali away to the near the corner. Finally, Ali moved away and Linston struggled to his feet. 17 seconds had passed. 10 seconds is all a fighter is allowed. The fight was over. The punch jarred him. Ali said afterwards, "It was a good punch, but I didn't think I hit him so hard he hadn't gotten up." Muhammad Ali had come to the fight in the best shape of his life. He was 23 years old. At the highest his physical powers, he had fought 12 professional fights and close to 100 amateur fights. He had a style that he could impose on Linston and the physical and material skills to do it. Linston had been intimidated not by Ali's physical presence, but by proposal of family and sickness situation in which he could not win. Ali would have one more fight in 1965. In November, he would go up against Floyd Patterson, the former world heavyweight champion. And in October 1965, article in Sports Illustrated, Patterson commented, "I had nothing but concerns for the black Muslims and that for which they stand. The invasion of black Muslims as the world heavyweight champion disgrace the sport and nation. Cass's claim must be beaten and a black Muslim circular removal from Boston." Patterson's remarks hurt and engaged Ali. He saw himself as being for the black man 100% and didn't like having his racial adherents questioned. Ali claimed that he had no racial animus against anyone, no matter their races or religion. His trainer, Angelo Dundee, was white. Ali had white friends among the sports widows, but that wasn't good enough for Patterson. He insisted that he would regain the championship for his Christianity. Ali took his revenge on November 22, 1965. He pounded Patterson without mercy, backing out each time Patterson looked like he could be knocked out. Finally, the referee eliminated the fight in the 12th round. Ali had won in tactical knockout. It was not a popular victory. A lot of sports writers wanted to see Patterson win. Moreover, they wanted to see Ali return being Cassius Clay. But what they saw was the best fighter in the world. What's my name? The 1960s were a turbulent decade. The decade in which the public learned to say no to the government's war in Vietnam and to injustice in America, and just to peace, love, and rock and roll. What's more, most of the real action scenes are around lone people called flower children in the streets of San Francisco walk to the vigorous sounds of gems dropping in a throat from the film arrest in Boston in the streets in protest against the Vietnam War. Americans who have reached the 18th birthday had to register for the drug and were issued drug cards. Anti-war protesters burned their drug cards to show their disapproval of the war in Vietnam. Black people wore hug raffles and hip-pies were flowers. In the South, African children marching in the streets along with their others, and college students sat down at the laws and countries waiting to greet the bearers of Surgeon General. For most Americans, each action was not only the statement in itself, but also simple. Some of those symbols became so powerful that they were interesting in recognizing. For some people, a brightly colored voice garrison, but the corridor with peace signs and flowers brought smiles of recognition. Here was a peace-loving, growing person in an in-law-faced car who was probably into help music and love between all people. But the peace movement had an extension to those Americans not lose the questioning what their government did. Protesting the war was close to treachery. To others, the idea that blacks were no longer willing to accept second-class citizenship was a symbol of social design. One of the major symbols of the 60s was the name change among members of the Nation of Israel. Michael X had been born Michael Little in Oklahoma, Nebraska. The name Michael had been given to him by his parents, but the name Little was, Michael said, a hand-me-down from the days of slavery. Most members of the Nation of Israel took the X, which stood for their unknown African names. When Cassius Clay became a minister, he also took a new name, Muhammad Ali. The symbols of the names changed, suggesting a more minimal turn to the civil rights movement. A winners that had bragging for fights now turned down matches to involve Ali. In March 1966, Ali went to Toronto, Canada to fight against George Crudup. 2 months later, he had a second fight with Henry Cooper in London. Ali won the match on a technical knockout when Cooper was so badly cut and bleeding that he could not continue the fight. On August 6, 1966, Ali defeated Brian London in another British heavyweight match lasting only 3 rounds. A month later, on September 10th, he beat Karl Mannerberger in Frankfurt, Germany. In England, in all European, Ali's in all Europe, Ali's popularity was growing. His name change did not have the same ceremonial aboard as it did in the United States. He personally was seen in Europe as just essentially an American baseman. Meanwhile, back home, there was increased interest to the civil rights movement. Protesting marches were being hit by police billy clubs and tear gas. In June 1966, a civil rights worker, James H. Murdoch, was shot as he lay marching on a plane line from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi in October 1966. The Black Panther Party was founded in Oklahoma, California, declaring the slaves' service to be for self-defense of black people. The Panthers openly carry rifles. This marks the day of a major escalation of military among blacks in the civil rights struggle. Ali was finally allowed to fight in Houston, Texas in November. Cleveland Williams has been a world-class fighter and a great puncher, but had horrible problems outside the ring. In 1964, before his fight with Ali, he had been severely injured by gunshots in the streets. Disturbance. He recovered in time for the fight, but was knocked out by Ali in 3 rounds. Early 1967, the news from Vietnam was not good. Long Americans were being killed at an alarming rate of war that seems we could not win. The news from the civil rights front lines looked just as black. For every victory, there was a setback. More and more blacks were among themselves, fearful of race war. Too many Americans, the lone fighters from Louisville, Kentucky, represented that all that was bad about the era. Ali was opening against the war, and he was a face and a voice to the country's racist problems. The problem for many Americans was not that blacks were forcing to the second-class census, but that they made themselves visible by protesting the Department of Racial Rights. On February 6, 1967, Ali fought against Elaine Terrell, who had made a point of telling the press that he would not call the man he knew as Cassius Clay by any other name. Terrell, a raggedy heavyweight, had a little chance against Ali, but his thoughts were damaging Ali's reputation. Spokeswomen were published interviews with fathers who were expressing their own dismissal over Ali's joining the Nation of Israel. What's my name? What's my name? Ali put the question to Terrell over and over again as he beat him mercilessly. In front of the same spokeswomen who had encouraged Terrell to make his statements about Ali. Spokeswomen such as the well-known Jimmy Kimmel took the occasion to say that Ali was racist and mean-spirited, and seen from Ali's flesh, he had the courage to call him Cassius Clay. He made no mysteries or terrorist remarks about Ali. Ali was not acting the way sportswears thought he should, and they were going to punish him for the in the press. Cassius Clay had registered for the draft on April 8, 1960, as required by law. It was given at 1A class infection on March 9, 1962. This is the class infection anyone is given until the undergoing physical and military tests to see if they are fit for military service. On January 24, 1964, he was ordered to the Armed Forces Induction Center in Corning, Florida, when he took qualifying examination. Clay scored below the qualifying scores on the standardizing and bulletin test at that time and again in March 1964. In February 1966, Clay, as he was still known to the draft board, was reclassified 1A. The draft board now saying that his test scores were acceptable. Ali applied the classification and also asked for status as a constitutional adjective, or CO status. Constitutional adjectives were those who, due to the religion or moral benefits, cannot participate in military service. This request was denied. And Ali asked for a hearing. And hearing was held on August 23, 1966. Ali had to convince the hearing officer that three things were true. The first was that he was essentially in his objective of military service. The second was that his objection was based on a religion, training, and belief. And the third was that his religion benefits were against all wars. In a written statement, and then in answer to questions put to him by the hearing officer, Ali said he understood that by refusing to enter the army, he was seriously injured his person's inability to earn living. He went on to say that as a missionary, he objected to protection anyway. In any war, the Quran, the holy text of the Muslim religion, forbids the taking of a life and the participation in any wars that is not defense of the Muslim faith. Allah put this forth to the hearing officer, and to the surprise of many, the hearing officer recommended him that Ali be given CO status. Despite the recommendation, his appeal was turned down by the draft board. Throughout the country, other lawmen were protesting U.S. popularity in the Vietnam War. Some were failing to counter, others went underground to avoid war that fought by more than one. Thousands of deaths applied for and receiving CR status based upon their relief benefits. But Muhammad Ali had become a symbol of anti-war movement. He was also a surprise superstar lawn. Lawn men and women who did not like his endearing to the Nation of Islam still respecting his decision to make what they saw was a positive racist statement in changing his name. In the late 60s, especially in the inner cities, few long blacks in high environments with whites, they might not subscribe to the racial deltas of the Nation of Islam, but neither were they very, very much affected by those deltas. The draft board felt that if Ali was given CO status, that all the members of the Nation of Islam could earn such as status. The date for Ali's induction into the army was set for April 28, 1967, in an interview for the April 10th edition of Sports Illustrated. Ali was asking how he felt about the Vietnam War. Why should they ask me to put on my uniform and then go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam while so-called people in Louisville are treating like dogs? He asked, any army induction ceremony is a simply unfair. Ali other inductions stand in lines and military officers call out their names. When an induction name is called, he steps forward. With people anyone in the group has made the symbol of step forward. There is a certain sentiment in ceremony. If an induction does not step forward, he is said to have refused induction and is then charged with a federal crime. The draft board listed Ali's name as Cassidy's Muscarius Clay, and that was the name called. Muhammad Ali refused to step forward. Freedom means being able to follow in the long religion, but it also means carry the responsibility to choose between right and wrong. He said, so when the time came for me to make up my mind about going in the army, I knew people were dying in Vietnam for nothing, and I should live by what I thought was right. I wanted American to be American. Because Joe Louis fought exhibition and helped raise money for the government during World War II, and because Sugar Ray Robinson had been signed into what the Army called special service, Ali was probably assured that he would be used only to raise the morale of troops. He would play the same role during the Vietnam War as Joe Louis and Sugar Ray Robinson had played during World War II. His senses would have been such as Hawaii to many. A group of elite black athletes, including football great Jim Brown and basketball star Bill Russell, and later on in the concert, who played Lil become a Muslim and take the name Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, called a meeting to talk to Ali. Some of them advising the long bosses to go into the army. It will be better than jail. The rest say recession. He will maintain his status as heavyweight champion. The feeling of many of the athletes pulled to meeting with Ali was that he was a loop being taken advantage of by the nation of Israel. However, after the meeting, they left with the realization that he was indeed long, but fond of his compensation and willing to live with the consequences of his actions. Ali, as he said he would, did not step forward when asked by the officials of the draft board after the Day 2 trial in June 1967, in which he was found guilty of refusing indication. He was given a maximum sentence of 5 years in probation, 5 years in probation, and a fine of $10,000. He was released, petitioned and appealed the case, and his passport was taken away. His heavyweight championship was taken away by the world boxing situation. Muhammad Ali, unbeaten in the ring, had finally failed. That's all for the book for now for this. The Greatest Muhammad Ali, Part 2. Part 3 is coming up soon. I'm Just Crow.